What's going on, Shield Brothers and Shield Maidens? This is True for Shield's Rest, and today I want to talk about adversary encounter building within Daggerheart using skeletons. So let's get into it. Alright, so today we are talking skeletons, which means we're going to get into the adversary stat blocks for skeletons, of which there are 4. I'm going to provide you with a bonus stat block, just one that's been reskinned to kind of give you more of a solo situation, as well as bring in a Necromancer leader and how we can tier that individual down, so that way you have something to work with that is actually a leader type for your encounter building, especially if you want to do this early on and not have to have a tier 4 Necromancer. We're also going to talk about an environment that we're going to bring out of the 1.5 manuscript here, which you can kind of tier up and tier down, and I'm going to go through how you can do that with this particular environment, and then we'll go through how you can build these encounters with these set adversary stat blocks, and really go from easy all the way to climactic. So let's start with our adversary stat block list, starting with the Dredge. So the Dredge is a minion, which means they're going to get the minion passive, but this is going to be for every 4 damage this time for this particular minion. They're also going to have a difficulty of 8, an attack modifier of -1, and physical damage of only 3. Now, funny enough, as far as minions are concerned, I actually like the Dredge. I don't normally like minions just in general, but the Skeleton Dredge is a great minion, mainly because of the feeling and that kind of themology and vibe that you get from this particular minion. It really adds into the encounters that we're about to build here, especially that feeling of overwhelming odds. Just this absolute dread that your players are going to feel is going to be fantastic when using the Skeleton Dredge. Alright, so next on our list is going to be the Skeleton Warrior. The Skeleton Warrior is your standard adversary with a difficulty of 10, 0 to their modifier, so they're not adding anything in when you roll, it's just a straight roll. You're also going to be bringing in a sword melee 2d6 plus 2 physical damage. They also have a major of 4 and a severe of 8 with 3 hit points and 2 stress. Now looking at their features, I do like their features. I will say the only bones passive was kind of surprising to me that they have resistance to physical damage. Mainly because coming from D&D, skeletons are actually vulnerable to bludgeoning damage, to be more particular. Even though here in Daggerheart, physical damage can encompass anything from bludgeoning to slashing to piercing, I still found this kind of surprising that they would go with this instead of making them more susceptible to physical damage rather than resistant to it. But I still like that just because it's really going to scare the crap out of your players. It's going to give them this feeling of dread for sure. And same goes for Won't Stay Dead. I think this is a great reaction to have, especially when you have a large group. This is going to be insane for your players to deal with, which is why typically I'm going to suggest that you actually have these at a tier below what your party actually is, so that way you can bring them and bring more of them and make this really feel unending death. So let's look at the Skeleton Archer. The Skeleton Archer is a ranged type adversary. Difficulty 9, attack modifier of +2, so this thing is meant to hit. And it's also meant to hit hard with this short bow far range, 2d8 plus 3 physical damage. It also brings to the table 4 for its major and severe 7, as well as 3 HP and 2 stress. So looking at the 2 features, their 2 features are actually pretty solid. They have Opportunist for a passive, which is nuts when 2 or more adversaries are very close to a target. All damage the archer deals to them is doubled. And so what this means is if you have, let's say, 2 skeleton warriors surrounding the target being one of the players, the archer can now double the damage done because of this. I think that's pretty cool. As well as Deadly Shot being their action, just having to mark their stress to do this, that's pretty solid. I think that's a really solid 2 features for an archer, which means I'm probably not going to be bringing too many of these, because if I bring too many of these, I'm probably killing the party at that point. Like, the party's going down at this point. So that's going to be one that I probably put into a climactic encounter. Or situationally, especially if the party's kind of infiltrating a fortress of some kind and there's obviously archer towers along the walls, there would be an easy encounter probably with a couple of archers, which then the party's going to, completely cut through these guys. But I could see these guys being extremely deadly in the right circumstances, which is kind of what we're going to go for just a little bit here. Again, we're not going to go for killing the party, but we want to go for scaring the crap out of the party and providing them with a healthy fear of skeletons. Which actually brings us to our next skeleton, being the Skeleton Knight. The Skeleton Knight is a Bruiser type adversary with a difficulty of 13, attack modifier of +2, and a rusty greatsword, melee 2d8 plus 5 physical damage. They do come to the table with a major 7 and severe 13, also with 5 hit points and 2 stress. Now, looking at the two features for the Skeleton Knight, I think it got some great features. These two features are solid, but so did all the other skeletons, in all honesty, and they work really well together, which is what I like about this, and you'll see that in our encounter build lists, because this can be deadly really quickly depending on how you build out these encounters, regardless of whether it's easy, standard, challenging, or climactic. But the features that the Knight brings is going to be Cut to the Bone, which is an action. It'll use some of that stress that it's got, as well as Dig 2 Graves, a reaction. Now, I really like this Dig 2 Graves reaction feature that the Knight comes with. When this adversary is killed, before it dies, it makes an attack against an enemy within very close range, prioritizing the enemy that killed it. On a success, the target takes 3d4 plus 8 physical damage, and loses 1d4 hope. I think this is a great way to build in loss of hope for features. Like, we should be doing this more often when it comes to adversaries that are negative energy charged, that are demons of some kind, things that are going to basically cause a loss of hope just from dealing with them in the first place. But to have features that actually cause this is wonderful. Now, I also like the Cut to the Bone action. All I have to do is mark a stress, and all of a sudden I can attack all enemies within very close range. Any that I succeed against using this Knight takes 2d8 plus 5 physical and marks a stress. That is wonderful. This Knight can be insanely deadly against a party, especially if there's a couple of them. But I really do like the way that this builds in as them being up front, taking the damage, getting after it, while the warriors are kind of supporting, and then you got your archers in the back just going to town, and the dredges just kind of absorbing some of that damage. I think there's a solid way to build out these encounters that can not only be fun and interesting, but also deadly and scary. So let's get into now one of the other adversary stat blocks that I'm kind of repurposing, because I wanted to grab a solo. Even though the Skeleton Knight is a solid adversary to bring to the table, I do want to bring in something a little bit more bulkier. Something that I can just send in and not have to worry about bringing all these extra adversaries. So I wanted to reskin a Cave Ogre. Now, you may be asking, why Cave Ogre? I like the idea of this Cave Ogre having been defeated by a skeleton army of some kind, and then the bones have been raised up. And now I have a solo type adversary that I can just throw at the players. Especially if this is a situation in which it's army on army action, and especially a defensive army, and you've got basically the humans trying to defend their town from this large skeleton force, and of course they're going to bring in some heavy guns. Well, what do their heavy guns look like? A damn Cave Ogre. You know what I mean? Like, let's use the Cave Ogre as the battering ram to get through the gates, you know, to really cause that fear and instill it into not only the people of this particular city, but also, hopefully, the players. Alright, so looking at the Cave Ogre is a tier 1 solo type adversary. Difficulty 15, attack modifier +1, and has a club melee attack with a 2d8 plus 5 physical damage. It also has major 8, severe 15, 6 HP, and 3 stress. And their experience is throw +2, obviously for their one of their features here. I actually want to keep all of that for this, let's call it, Skeleton Ogre. You know, we can name it whatever. It doesn't matter right now as far as what the name is. You can name it whatever. But I really like what it comes with already. And then looking at its features, you could almost keep these features in general. You could probably keep these features just as is, and it not really take away from the whole experience of this being an undead Cave Ogre. Now, you could replace one of these if you really wanted to with something that's a little more on theme. That's perfectly fine, especially if you want to add in the loss of 1d4 hope. I love that idea. And you can just tag that on to, I don't know, Hail of Boulders or even the Rampaging Fury. You could totally do that. Bonebreaker does also make sense, especially if he's swinging that large club. It kind of makes sense that it's going to be more effective than your typical attack. So you could really just leave this adversary stat block as is and just reskin it to call it a skeleton ogre. Alright, so let's look at the Arch Necromancer next, because I want to get into a leader type adversary for my encounters that I want to build with these skeletons. And let's face it, a Necromancer is completely on theme and just fits the bill for what I'm looking for. Now, generic, yes. Could you pick something else? Absolutely. You could probably bring in a Spectral Captain if you wanted to. You could probably bring in any number of other leader type adversaries out there if you really wanted to, especially to just be different. That's perfectly fine. I, however, just wanted to grab the Arch Necromancer because it's just something we all know and love, and let's face it, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. So with the Arch Necromancer, that's a tier 4 adversary. We don't necessarily need it to be a tier 4 adversary, though. This is where we can start actually doing a little bit of downgrading for our Arch Necromancer and really bring it down to like a tier 1, perhaps a tier 2 situation. So that way we've got a leader to work with in our more challenging and climactic situations. And that's kind of what we want to have ready to go at our disposal if necessary. So let's go ahead and look at how can we possibly tier down this Necromancer, as well as how he can actually end up fitting into these environments that we're going to create. Even though it's the same environment, we're going to just retheme it a little bit and just change the tiers. So that way it can be tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and of course, tier 4. So looking at the Arch Necromancer, this comes stock as a difficulty 23, attack plus 6, with a necrotic blast, far range 2d10 plus 25 magic damage. It does also have a 33 for its major, 66 for its severe, 10 HP, and 8 severe. Now it also comes with experiences that we probably aren't going to use, especially at like a tier 1, tier 2 situation, for Ancient Knowledge and Wisdom of Centuries. Now, the features that it comes with are fantastic. It comes with 5 features that range from actions to reactions. No passives here. You will notice there are no passives, but that doesn't mean you can't build in a passive if you really wanted to, especially when we're talking about tearing down the adversary and you wanted to grab a passive that is more fitting a lower ranking sort of Necromancer. Obviously, we're not going to call it an Arch Necromancer at like tier 2 or anything like that. We're just going to call it a Necromancer or a lesser Necromancer, a studying Necromancer, apprentice Necromancer, something along those lines, right? But looking at its features, you can see that these features are pretty wild, especially the 2 reactions, the your life is mine and not today, my dears. Like, those 2 are some pretty crazy reactions. And I absolutely love that, but I also like the actions that it comes with. Open the Gates of Death is a wonderful action. Now, you can replace this with, instead of a Zombie Legion, you can replace this with some, let's say, Skeleton Dredge. Or maybe some Skeleton Warriors, depending on what tier you're at. You could really just do it that way if you wanted to. No problem. Also, Beam of Decay is fantastic, especially when you just want to use up some of your stress, just to mark your 2 stress, just to use it. This thing is deadly, which means if we are to keep this feature, let's say at tier 2, or if we do go as far as to go down to tier 1, we're probably going to draw this down, assuming that we keep this feature with our tier 2, tier 1 sort of Necromancer, okay? We definitely don't want it to be 2d20 plus 12 magic damage. That is wild. And requiring a strength 23 save, that's nuts. But its Dance with Death action is actually pretty solid as is, and one that I would keep throughout all of our tiers, regardless of whether that's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and obviously, of course, tier 4. So now let's look at how we can tier down this adversary. And I do want to make him a tier 2 adversary. Mainly because it gives him a little bit more survivability, so even if my tier 1 party's dealing with this already, which probably won't, but even if they are dealing with this tier 2 Necromancer, they're still going to be able to deal with this, but at least the Necromancer's not so much of a pushover at these lower tiers, okay? Now, looking at how we can tier down this Necromancer, I'm kind of doing this on the spot with you guys, mainly because I want you to see how easy this really is, especially when I'm just looking at Chapter 6, looking right at the book, page 389. I can see that we start off with the attack modifier. So instead of it being a +6, like on our tier 4 Arch Necromancer here, I want to bring this down to being a normal Necromancer level. So let's make it more of a +3 situation. Let's go ahead and have that down. Or what we could do is we could make it a +2, but I feel like +3 is good enough, especially when it comes to the ability for this Necromancer to hit. I do want this Necromancer to be able to hit more often than not, and a +3 is going to help us out here. So now looking at the next part of this chapter, we're going to look at scaling damage, because right now we're sitting at a 2d10 plus 25 magic damage. We kind of want to change that up a bit. Obviously, that's some tier 4 severe damage, as we can see by our charts. We want to then take this and turn this into more of severe damage for a tier 2 situation, right? Which means that's going to be a 2d8 plus 12, which is what we want to kind of go for. But if you wanted to scale it down just a little bit more, you could, and you could go with a 2d10 plus 4, and that'd get you major damage more consistently, which I think is going to be good for a Necromancer. Right around there is where you want to be, and then when you scale up to, like, let's say tier 3, that can be a 2d10 plus 18, and then when you finally get to tier 4, it gets you right back to where you should be anyways. So, works out really well, I think. Alright, so let's look at scaling difficulty. So the Necromancer, as we can see, is a 23 for difficulty at tier 4. Per our chart here, we have 20 at tier 4. Which means this Necromancer is a little bit higher than the suggested tier 4 difficulty. Which is perfectly fine. The whole point is to kind of tweak things that make a little bit more sense for the particular adversary we're talking about. Which means at tier 2, it's suggesting 14. Let's go ahead and make this a 16. 16 makes sense to me anyways for a tier 2 situation. So let's start off with that, and if it's too hard to hit, we'll just tweak from there. Make it a little bit easier, start handing out advantage a little bit more when it comes to some of those encounters, especially when we don't want this Necromancer to be completely OP. So, let's start off with that at tier 2. So let's look at scaling damage thresholds, because that's the next part of this chapter. And let's face it, right now, 33 and 66 is pretty up there, which looks to be about tough to extra tough when it comes to looking at the chart. So, for a tier 2, tough would be about 15 and 26, whereas extra tough would be more like 18 major and 28 severe, which I think extra tough kind of works for what we're going for, but again, it really depends on the context for your particular Necromancer. You may want to make this just plain old tough, and that's perfectly fine. So personally, I'm going to make it more of an 18 and 28 and just stick with what the chart says. I'm not going to deviate from that like they have here where it's a little bit of in between. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to stick with the extra tough and call it a day. So if you watch my how-to video for how to tier up or tier down an adversary, you'd know that the HP and the stress don't really change. Not through all the tiers. However, you can make that executive decision to go ahead and draw down that HP and that stress. I'm going to keep it at 10 HP and 8 stress. I just want to keep it that way, mainly because the Necromancer is kind of squishy otherwise, so it's going to be really easy to kill this guy off, and especially when they've already chewed through all the adversaries, especially because a lot of those adversaries are going to be one tier lower, at least in my viewpoint. I'm going to have those adversaries one tier lower than the actual party itself, so when they hit tier 2, those adversaries are going to stay at tier 1. I want to keep it that way, because skeletons don't need to be tiered up too often, unless you're really drawing in a lot of power, like this is an Arch Necromancer here. That's when you want to kind of maybe tier up some of those skeletons, because they would have that power coursing through their marrow, perhaps. So you could have that going on. But here, we're just going to keep the HP and the stress as is. But again, you can make that executive decision if you want to change it or not. So as far as the experience is concerned, you can change that if you want to. I'm going to keep it the same as is, but I'm probably going to draw down its pluses, mainly because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for it to be a +3 as a tier 2 Necromancer when you probably don't have that knowledge like that, but it still works either way. It's not going to be groundbreaking, game-breaking at all if you use the experiences as is. I would want to change up the experiences just a little bit to fit the context of this particular Necromancer that I have, but really and truly, built as is, you're perfectly fine. So the next part I want to talk about is the features. Now, the book doesn't really get into the features and what you should or should not have, but it's kind of evident from just all the other stat blocks out there, when you can look at what the leaders have, they're not going to have 5 features at tier 2. They're probably going to have more like 3. So let's go ahead and draw those 5 down to 3. So that way it's a little more on par. And I've got 3 picked out just for this Necromancer, which would probably make sense. But again, you can replace them with whatever you want, perfectly fine. So I want to start off with Dance of Death. I definitely want to keep that. Love Dance of Death, as well as Not Today, My Dears. I think that is a great one to have, mainly because it gives your Necromancer the ability to leave and just completely teleport. So that way you can keep this adversary going if it works. Mind you, if it works. I would probably draw that down a little bit to be more of a 20 instinct to trace him rather than a 23. But outside of that, that's about it. Nothing too crazy, and you can just leave it as a 23, and that's perfectly fine. But I also want to grab Beam of Decay. Beam of Decay is a great one to have just as an action overall, mainly because you want this and you want to build it as you go through the tiers, so that way you get back to that tier 4 level, especially if you're using Not Today, My Dears, because then that way this adversary is going to stick around and be a part of your campaign for a while, probably. So that way they can meet them at tier 3 at some point. That'd be a lot of fun. But anywho, so let's go ahead and address the 2 glaring issues with Beam of Decay as is at tier 4, because we do want to make this more tier 2. Let's go ahead and change the strength reaction roll here from 23 to 16, okay? Now we also want to change the damage from 2d20 plus 12 magic damage, and let's go ahead and change that to 2d10 plus 10 magic damage. But that's how you tier down an adversary right there on the spot. That's how we can take a tier 4 and make it a tier 2, no problem. So don't be afraid to look at other adversary stat blocks and see how can you bring them down to the level that you want them to be, or bring them up to the level that you want them to be. Because if you want to take that tier 4 down to tier 2, that took no time at all. We were just using the charts from chapter 6, page 389, and working through those few pages, and now we have a fully capable tier 2 sort of adversary. And it didn't take us that long to do it. I mean, look at that. That's nothing at all. So, love that to death. But now that we've got our Arch Necromancer down to a tier 2 situation, and we've got our tier 1 adversaries with the Skeleton Warrior, the Skeleton Archer, the Skeleton Dredges, and the Skeleton Knights, we now need an environment to put them in. So let's go ahead and look at the Ossuary environment. Alright, so let's look at the Necromancer's Ossuary, which is a tier 4 environment. Let's look at it as is, and then see what we can do to change it from tier 4 to tier 3, to tier 2, to tier 1. So to start off with, it is a tier 4 exploration type environment. Has a difficulty of 19, and the potential adversaries are an Arch Necromancer, Perfected Zombie, and Zombie Legion. Alright, so let's look at the features. There are 4 features that this environment comes with, and the first one is actually one that we want to keep throughout all the tiers, and that is going to be No Place for the Living, which is a passive feature. Any feature or action that will heal HP requires spending a hope, or an additional hope if it already costs a hope. I think that is perfect. That not only gives you the theme that you want, but it also forces the players to really consider their next moves, especially when it comes to those healers out there that also need to spend hope to heal. Now, looking at Sentries of Knowledge, PCs may investigate the library or laboratory within the ossuary for information, and this basically is going to use a Knowledge 19 roll, and it gives you the outcomes based off of how they rolled, okay? That's where the difficulty for this environment actually comes into play, is in the features. This is not conferring a new difficulty to all the adversaries within this environment. It is just the difficulty for the environment itself. So all the adversaries will maintain their original difficulties, and they will not take on this difficulty of 19. Now, looking at Aura of Death, this is going to cost 2 action tokens, or if you moved over to just using fear tokens, this is just going to cost 2 fear. That's it. So once per scene, roll 1d4. Each undead within a far distance of the Necromancer may clear that many stress and or HP. I really do like that one, and that is one that I'd want to have at probably like tier 2, if not tier 3 for sure. But this is fantastic for being able to show just how suffused negative energy is within this location. Now, I would replace that with whatever the adversary is, the main adversary is. So like if you're not using a Necromancer and let's say you're using a Spectral Captain for whatever reason, just use Spectral Captain within far range of them. Or insert whatever adversary is your main dude. So don't worry about it just being Necromancer, okay? Now looking at They Just Keep Coming, this is another action that is going to require a fear. So spend a fear to summon 1d6 tier 3 zombie minions, 2 perfected zombies, or a tier 3 zombie horde. They appear at close distance. Now I would replace this with probably about, especially if you're upgrading the tiers for your skeletons, I'd replace this with 1d6 tier 2 skeleton dredges, or 4 skeleton warriors, or 2 skeleton knights. All right, now looking at how do we scale down this environment so that way it fits the different tiers that we really want these environments to come in at. And what would we call it instead of a Necromancer's Ossuary? So if I wanted to scale this down to, say, tier 3, I'd probably make this more of a mansion or a large house of some kind that has a library, that has all these things going on in it, instead of this underground situation that the tier 4 environment's supposed to be. I'm probably going to utilize a mansion of some kind, and could be vampires. Again, that's another option for who might be over this skeleton army. Let's bring in a little Warhammer fantasy, why not? But for this, let's call it a mansion for tier 3. So looking at this, what would we change? I would probably remove They Just Keep Coming, or I would remove Aura of Death. I'd want to remove one of those two, but I'd probably knock off They Just Keep Coming, just to show that this still maintains a lot of the energy that we want it to have, but not all the danger with summoning more adversaries that weren't originally a part of this to begin with. So that would be my suggestion. The difficulty I would draw down to 17, but I could keep the difficulty at 19. I actually wouldn't be opposed to keeping it at difficulty 19, especially for Centuries of Knowledge. So that's just one suggestion for tier 3. Now looking at tier 2, this would be more like a dark library or a ruined church of some kind. And because I think it still works no matter how you slice it. And then what you can do is you can either remove Centuries of Knowledge or you can remove Aura of Death. I would suggest removing Centuries of Knowledge if you're going to make it a ruined church, or if you're going to make this a dark library, remove Aura of Death. And I just remove one feature. But if you're going to do that, go ahead and make the difficulty more like 15 or 16, and that would probably be about right for a tier 2 situation. Now looking at tier 1, I'd probably make this more of a basement of some kind, or a graveyard. Now the basement, obviously this individual's been brooding down there, listening to AFI. They've been, obviously through some tough times, but whatever. So whatever the situation is, this individual has probably been pouring a lot of energy into it. Or they have an item of some kind that is creating all this energy being poured into this. I would still maintain No Place for the Living. And then at that point, I would keep Aura of Death, and that would be it. If I even keep that at all, I may just remove Aura of Death entirely and just keep it as No Place for the Living and leave it at that. That is perfectly fine, and then you don't even need a difficulty, so don't even worry about the difficulty at this point. But that's what I would use for a tier 1. And that's if I'd want to use the environment at all, and I think I would. I see these environments that Daggerheart has as a way to enhance your encounters, to make them more on par with what they should be and also feel like. But that's what I'd have at tier 1. I think environments are a great thing to kind of bring into your encounters more often than not, mainly because it really provides that theme that you're looking for, as well as enhancing the encounters themselves to make them a little bit more dynamic, just a little bit. And then you can do the rest of that work with your adversaries themselves, as well as the context that surrounds the entire encounter. Love it. Love it to death. So that's how I'd use the environments. All right, let's get into the last part of this video, which is going to be our encounters themselves. So let's build out our list from easy, standard, to challenging, to climactic. And the first part that we want to get into is obviously easy, but really and truly what we're going to do is we're going to assume that we're dealing with a party of 4 individuals, 4 characters, so that way we can kind of keep the numbers pretty simple. Now, if you haven't seen my rules breakdown for how to create encounters from easy to standard to challenging and climactic, go ahead and check that out right now, because you're going to want to know this before you get into how we actually are going to build these out, so you understand what we're talking about here. Alright, so let's start off with our easy encounter, keeping in mind that we do have 4 party members that we're going to be building this encounter for. So that means that we're probably going to bring in 3 skeleton warriors and let's say a skeleton knight, or perhaps a skeleton archer, to kind of bulk things out properly. So that would be right about on par with what an easy encounter would be. Or if our party is scaling, let's say a fortress wall of some kind, archer tower, let's go ahead and go with 4 archers or even 3 archers. Perfectly fine. That should be right about on par with what an easy encounter would be for our party members. Now getting into our standard encounter. This is where we're going to start bringing in our skeleton dredges, or even that skeleton ogre that we were talking about, just reskinning and bringing in. We can go ahead and start doing that now, and this is going to equal a standard encounter. So if we start off with just the cave ogre being the skeleton ogre, that works just fine as is by himself, no problem. But if we want to start using the minions, let's go ahead and bring in 3 to 4 skeleton dredges here. And then let's also bring in maybe a couple of warriors. Let's maybe do a couple of archers, or even let's bring in a knight and a couple of warriors. And that's probably on par with those 4 skeleton dredges, no problem. Now something to think about is going to be minion groups. So I would probably bring, especially if my party's tier 2, I'd probably bring in about 2 skeleton dredges per group. So I'd bring in 4 groups of 2 skeleton dredges to be on par with what I'm looking for as far as the themology is concerned, about that kind of fear that I want to instill into my players. That's really what we want to start doing, right? We want our players scared to deal with these skeletons just a little bit. So doing that with the minions is a good way to kind of instill that fear. So again, tier 2, I'm going to bring in 2 minions into that one group. So 4 groups of 2 minions each. However, if they're tier 3, I'm going to bring in 3 skeleton dredges per minion group. Now, mind you, I'm not tiering up these minions in any way, shape, or form, which means they're going to be really easy for the party to deal with, and they're not going to take a ton of damage in the process, okay? So it really does work out in the end. It's just, patience. And again, we're trying to instill this fear, and this is a great way to do it when you're getting overwhelming numbers coming at you. So always fun. Now, if you don't want to use minions in this standard encounter, again, perfectly fine. I typically don't, but when it comes to skeletons, I typically do, just because I like the skeleton dredges more than anything else, just from the way the vibe works out. So love that, but if you don't want to use minions, you can bring in 5 skeleton warriors. That's perfectly fine. Again, I remove minions, and then I basically replace it with half of the party in adversaries. So if I have 4 party members, I'm going to bring in 2 extra adversaries on top of the adversaries that I'm supposed to bring anyways. So works out to be about 5 skeleton warriors, because if you're bringing in 3 already and then you have your 4 party members, 2 more skeleton warriors added on top equals your 5. No problem. If you really wanted to, you could replace one of those with a skeleton knight, and that would be very interesting and a lot of fun, especially with the 4 other warriors right there. Even better. If you even want to replace one of those skeleton warriors with an archer, that makes it way more interesting when you have 3 skeleton warriors, 1 knight, and 1 archer, and that archer is going to be deadly, just standing in the back firing, leveling arrows into the party. Now, if you really wanted to get diabolical, especially within this standard encounter, even though it's not going to be considered challenging yet, it's going to feel challenging just a little bit, and that's going to be bringing those minion groups, those 4 minion groups of 2, assuming that the party's at tier 2, and then what you're going to do is you're going to bring in 3 archers. And they're just going to stand in back and let their wall of dredges go forward as they start firing into the party. And it's going to be nuts with Opportunist and even that deadly shot. Like, whew, I don't want to deal with that. I'm just saying. I would be scared of these skeletons at that point. So, all right, let's start talking about our challenging encounters. This is going to be when we can finally bring in our Necromancer, our tiered down tier 2 Necromancer. Bring him in. Bring in those 4 skeleton dredges, or the minion groups, depending on how you want to go about it. Bring those guys in, and you're going to have a fun time, especially if it's in the environment that we've created. Let's do that, just saying. Now, if you don't want to necessarily bring in the Necromancer quite yet, not for a challenging encounter, maybe you're not quite there, that's perfectly fine. What you can then do is let's go ahead and bring in our solo as well. Let's bring in that cave ogre, and then we can add in the minions, or what we could do is we could bring in, say, 2 warriors to go with them. Because, again, we do want to, if we're going to remove the minions, we do want to replace that with half the party size in adversaries, which would be 2 adversaries. And I would keep it standard type so that Skeleton Warrior is perfectly fine. So let's say you don't want to bring in any minions and you just want to bring just adversaries. The best setup that I can think of that's going to be pretty fun and rather dynamic is going to be 4 warriors, 1 knight, and 2 archers. Archer's obviously sitting in the back, the knight being up front, flanked by his warriors, moving forward, dealing with the party. It's going to be tough for them, but it's going to be a lot of fun. And I think that as a challenging encounter is mainly meant for groups that have strategy and actually implement those tactics into the encounter. So I would reserve it just for that if I were you. But if you want more of a standard challenging encounter that uses minions, that uses adversaries, obviously bring in the 4 skeleton dredges and then bring in, let's say, 4 warriors or 2 warriors and 2 archers. No problem. All right, let's start talking about the challenging encounter, which means we're going to bring it all together. We're going to bring it all in, which means the leader, the environment, the minions, the adversaries, we're bringing it all in, okay? So that would be 4 skeleton dredges, or the minion groups if you really want to use that. Not going to say no to it, just saying. Obviously, we're going to bring in whatever tier the party is in the encounter, in the environment, rather. We're going to definitely bring that environment in because, let's face it, it is too good not to use. Come on now. Now, obviously, we do want to bring in the right tier Necromancer, but tier 2 is probably not going to be bad here, especially if you're using minion groups. Tier 2 Necromancer is perfectly fine. And let's face it, you definitely want to use him. Or the Spectral Captain, again, whatever you choose is whatever you choose, but come on, can't go wrong with the Necromancer. And then let's go ahead and bring in 4 warriors, or 2 warriors, 2 archers, or even 1 knight, 2 warriors, and 1 archer sitting in the back. Have some fun with that. Obviously, some good combinations, and no matter how you slice it, it's going to be deadly. It is going to be deadly, and it's going to be so much fun. And let's face it, climactic encounters should feel semi-deadly. Ain't nothing wrong with that. So go ahead and, skirt the line, flirt with it a little bit. Play some jump rope with that line and scare the crap out of your players. Especially if your players have to start thinking about, well, maybe we need to get the hell out of here. Like, hell yeah, you do. So have some fun with that. Don't shy away from making encounters too deadly. I'm not saying kill your players, but every now and again you want to remind them that it is very possible for them to go ahead and kick the can. But that's it for this adversary encounter builder, using skeletons, bringing in a reskinned adversary, using environments. You cannot go wrong with that. So consider using environments more often, because really and truly, it makes your encounters so much more dynamic and so much more fun to play. Just saying. But if you found this video helpful, please let me know down in the comments below. Hit the like button. And if you are not subscribed, consider subscribing. We have so much content here on the channel. I'm doing tons for Daggerheart. The fellas are doing great with DC-20, and we're even doing Lancer together, which is a wonderful mech RPG. So check out those videos if you haven't seen them already. And until the next one, y'all, keep that shield wall strong.